Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Really excited. Today, you've had a couple of weeks of Josh and myself talking at you, and this time we've got someone from a company that isn't Spectacles to come in and tell you all about how they're using Looker. So we've got Mitch Posluns from Assurance here today. He will do a full introduction for himself shortly. But they have, over their usage of Looker, kind of started thinking a lot and deploying hub and spoke architecture and thinking about how you can really use Looker in interesting ways at scale, and how you might use certain frameworks in order to get around some of the issues that lots of large organizations using Looker eventually hit with scale. And so really excited for his talk, and looking forward to having him here to speak with all of us. Before I hand over to him, just some admin. We've got our next two webinars scheduled. So if this is the first time you're joining us, we do these every 2 weeks. They're really all about bringing the Looker community together. This isn't really about selling any specific piece of software or anything like that. It's really just to help us all become better Looker practitioners, hear from interesting people who are doing interesting things with Looker. And so they're every other Wednesday right around this time. And so in 2 weeks, we will be talking about the Google Sheets and Looker integration, what Looker's calling connected sheets, which is a way as they have their LookML models kind of pushed into other tools for analysis, how they're building that. And then in 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about how you can use the system activity explorers in Looker to understand certain parts of your usage, how Looker's functioning, where you can save money, where you can save performance, who's using the tool, who's not, and all that type of stuff. So if you are interested in joining those, you can always find all of our webinars at spectacles.dev/webinars. You can find recordings of all of our prior webinars and always find our future ones there as well. The final thing I'm going to say, as I've mentioned a couple times before we properly kicked off, is we'll be having all the Q&A and discussion around this webinar as we normally do in our Slack community. I've just dropped a link to the Slack community in the chat, and there is a channel which I'm also about to share called Webinar Hub and Spoke, which you should join. As you have questions for Mitch as he is talking, go over there, ask your questions in there, and then he and I will run a Q&A session after the bulk of his kind of core presentation. We'd also love to hear where you're calling from. So if you haven't yet dropped a note in there letting us know where you're based in the world, where you're joining us from, we'd love to see that as well. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Mitch. So all yours.
Thanks, Dylan. So I'm Mitch, as mentioned. The topic today, hub and spoke architecture for scaling organizations, which at this point Assurance is. So I wanted to kind of walk through what it is and share some insights and learnings along the way. Before I jump in, though, in the Slack channel, Dylan's pinned it to the top of the channel, there is a question around what brought you to the webinar today. So wondering if your Looker instance is an absolute tire fire and you're looking for ideas to help clean it up. If you're using hub and spoke, if you have a different framework that you're already using, or if your instance is perfect and you just like seeing others in pain, as Dylan happily described. So I would suggest folks, if you join the Slack channel, to check that out and just put the emoji of your choice. We're really curious to see kind of where people are at. And it will, as it does differ, as Dylan mentioned, as an organization is in its different stages and scale and the different roadblocks and challenges they face. So with that, a little background on me. I'm an analytics manager at Assurance. I've been to the company for about 4.5 years now, but I have about 6 years experience in data at data roles, startups of varying sizes. So when I first started in the startup world, I was role 10. So it was about, for a company of 10 rather, as like a single room shop, all hacking away. When I joined Assurance, it was about 70 employees, and now we've scaled up. We have about a headcount of 500 employees, plus thousands of agents around the United States. Gets us into Assurance, the business. Just some background on us. We are an insurance technology distribution platform. So it's kind of like the Uber of insurance. We have these agents all around the country. They're all licensed and qualified to sell different products. We have shoppers all around the country, all looking for different insurance and financial plans. We have the technology platform to connect these two entities, shoppers and consumers, with the insurance providers. And we have a lot of machine learning powered systems that help evaluate what are the best plans for shoppers, who are the best agents to speak to, and we do that matchmaking in between. And product recommendation is something certainly a problem near and dear to our hearts, and is going to be brought up a few times in the presentation. So be tuned in for that. But for me personally, I started in analytics, working on uncovering business insights and helping the operators optimize. But over time, I shifted to data platform and analytics engineering as I realized, as I kept repeating the same task, recognizing that surely there must be a better way to scale up our operations. Looker being a key tool in that. Over the past 4 years, just some information about our instance and our operations. We scaled from about 10 developers when I started to 55 unique contributors now. There were about 100 weekly active users internally, and now we have over 350. We've embedded use cases for front-end apps, for example, powering our agent-facing dashboard in our internal software. We've also deployed multiple Looker instances to share internal metrics with external partners secure. And we've experimented with and learned from multiple LookML frameworks, like hub and spoke architecture, which of course is the topic of today's webinar. So the agenda for the rest of the talk, we're going to chat a little bit about the Looker landscape and the associated challenges as organizations scale. Dylan mentioned. We're going to talk about overcoming those challenges. Spoiler alert, the prescription here is hub and spoke architecture. So we're going to chat about what the implementation actually looks like, some of the key features you should be aware of, as well as some cultural and technical considerations. It's simple in theory, but there's a lot more to consider if you're actually trying to do this, depending on your organization's scale and complexity. And we're also going to cover some practical applications for multi-instance management, domain-specific development, and permission systems as well. So starting with the overview of the Looker landscape, if you're on this call, I'm assuming you probably have some familiarity with Looker, but if you're very new to it, I thought it'd be worthwhile just chatting about some of the pros and cons to its origin a little bit. So I like to think of it as kind of this category defining tool of the mid 2010s. We roll back the clock about 10 years now. Early 2010s, like data warehouses, database architecture was really improving, tools like Redshift coming on the scene. And the founders of Looker recognized that organizations needed a way to make sense of these data warehouses. So they created what I would define as quite category defining in terms of the semantic layer LookML data fabric. A lot of the buzz around DBT today, if you're familiar with DBT, is they've launched a semantic layer. They acquired a company called Transform to help with that. But Looker was actually the OG. I like to think of it as the OG, where they had created the LookML semantic layer long ago, and really, I think, helped pioneer in this category. And as part of that, they really have a lot of great features for small data teams that may be lacking in data engineering resources. So if you've ever used a persistent derived table that actually is materializing data sets in your database, Looker was doing that well before DBT came on the scene. DBT just really popularized it and open sourced it as well. But other features in Looker like data caching, localization, all of those are really helpful infrastructure features that help, if you're a small shop, for example, provide a really great performant experience for your end users without a lot of technical sophistication. But it is a double-edged sword. So with this great category defining proprietary LookML system, it can become very unwieldy without clear structure and guidelines. It's kind of like having a Ferrari without having a full driver's license. And as a result, data teams can run into problems with poor UX for both developers and also, more importantly, consumers, where the Explorer interfaces might be confusing, the actual database performance might be slow, and the results might actually just be sometimes plain wrong, which, if you know the old adage, bad data is worse than no data, that is certainly not something we as data teams want to provide. So what are some of the, digging into this a little bit deeper, some of the common problems and impacts that come as a result? What's really interesting is that these actually start to build and compound. And by the time we get to bring trust in data, you can see how these interlink. So the first problem, and a lot of companies do this, Assurance certainly did this to start. It was just kind of like a free-for-all. All users, all developers can access, develop, and deploy against all LookML code. At its peak, our sort of single monolithic repo had 70,000 lines and a model file, 7,000 lines. A lot of LookML consistency in there. There's over 500 view files. We've been very sort of various and sort of complex business. We don't have massive data volumes, but the complexity is something that is really a challenge here as we go into lots of different insurance lines, lots of different carriers to deal with, et cetera. So what you get in the LookML code base is inconsistency, and your development cycle starts to slow down because it gets so unwieldy, there's not really clear ownership of it. People might be on one team at some point in time, switch teams at another point in time, their style is differing. So what you start to get is a lack of data ability, and the swampiness starts to grow. And then in the swamp, what surfaces? You get field and explore duplication, as people don't realize that they're actually reinventing the wheel, creating the same joins over and over, exposing the same similar data assets, what have you. That then leads to a confusing and slow explore, discovery, and interface for end users. This has definitely happened at Assurance, and it's probably happened where you work too, where you have two fields that are very similarly named in a view that's very similarly named, but they produce different results. You get difficulty trusting metrics, and then you get that end result of faltering trust in data. And more importantly, for those on this call, the teams that maintain it. We do not want to lose face with our stakeholders because the data work is so critical. So if you're having this problem, I've definitely had it before. Sure, some folks from Assurance are on this call. I'm sure they can relate. Don't feel bad, because Looker/Google, the people that invented this tool, actually admit to having the problems they just described. Bit of a gotcha for you. Every single problem that was on the left side of the slide previously came directly off of this presentation that Looker produced, called How We Model Looker at Looker. They released it in like October of 2022. And they admitted that they had a single project, sort of monolithic style, just massive model files. And they had all the problems. They had, people at Google and Looker failing to trust their own data. And what they prescribed is, as a solution, is this hub and spoke project architecture. And when I started reading about this, there were some articles online. They didn't have this really great polished video, but I'm actually just going to use a few of the screenshots to walk through what this is to help set the stage for the rest of the presentation. But I highly recommend you check this out if you're interested in hub and spoke architecture. It is, as you can see there, it's about 12 and a half minutes, or about 12 minutes. Some really great insights as well in there. But at a high level, it's simple in theory. You have this sort of hub project that these spokes can connect to and modify as they need. And each of these in a little bit more detail. You start with the hub that's managed and owned by the data team. All that core business logic is in there. They say there's no model files as well, but basically you're defining that semantic layer. You take your key data lake or warehouse assets, and you're defining the sort of cardinality, the joins, and then you can use those as building blocks to then provide to end developers to sort of customize the experience for end users. So out of the hub, you can then connect an official spoke, and that's where you might define the model, your core metrics model, sort of internal non-restricted data. For a company like Assurance, that might power our view from the top like dashboard, where we talk about the number of active agents, how many hours they've been on the platform, how many applications they've submitted, what's the LTV of our customers, et cetera. But we might have other use cases. For example, like our product recommendations team might be experimenting with a new algorithm. They might go and build on the core asset and add in their product recommendation experiment view and create these unique use cases. They can configure that for their department within their team, and they can provide that to end users as well. And you may have use cases as well. But you can basically see how this system, once you have that hub defined, can just scale out almost infinitely, depending on your number of departments, domains, use cases, et cetera. So if you want to do this, as I mentioned, kind of simple in theory. It does depend on a few features you should definitely be aware of, which we're going to go through in more detail today. The first is project import. This is kind of the bread and butter, the key linchpin of the whole thing. Without project import, it does not work. If you haven't heard of this feature, it's pretty awesome. It kind of blew my mind when I discovered it, is where you can sync up Looker projects and have one project read in from the other and access all of the information, all the views and explorers within it. So there's two ways to do this. There's a remote import, which is across instances, where you actually point it at the Git URL or repository and specify what branch you want it to be synced with. Or you can do it locally, which is within an instance itself. So they essentially accomplish the same thing, but there's some nuances to be aware of. With remote import, you actually have to, as a developer, manually tell Looker that you want to update the dependency and sort of refresh which commit for the state of the imported project. So what this means is you can actually be several commits behind the hub without manually updating it. And that may actually be intentional. So in the cases where you're working with external partners, let's say, and you're like versioning what you provide to them, it can be helpful to like change the hub and then, a few weeks later, prepare them for change especially if they build dependencies on the data you're providing them. With local import, it's a little bit different. Any changes you make in development mode can actually be reflected immediately. So you could be in the hub, make a change, and you want to test how that changes your spoke. You then jump back to the spoke, your development change is right there. And it's a lot easier to iterate that way. So they both accomplish the same thing, but if you're doing hub and spoke on a single instance, definitely use local import. It'll be way faster. You'll have way fewer PRs, and your developers will definitely thank you. I made the mistake personally when I first started this out on the internal instance, doing remote, because I did it on our external instance first. You definitely want to use local. So the second sort of feature, actually set of features, what I might call modular LookML code. These are really great features. We're going to go into them in a little bit more detail, extensions, refinements, and layers. But before I do, I just wanted to speak a little bit to the benefits of them. What's great about the modular LookML code is it allows your code base to be DRY or dry code, don't repeat yourself. That allows you to build on what's been done before. You don't have to like copy paste joins or do anything like that. It's way easier and faster to make changes. Your code will be way more consistent, and it's a lot easier to manage the sort of customization and personalization that's happening in those spoke or domain projects. And on the right-hand side here, this is a visualization of hub and spoke that I found. Coincidentally, it's actually the Assurance logo colors, which is great. I didn't make this though. It's from the article that's linked there, modular LookML in hub and spoke. But this is a visual representation of what's happening, where you have that hub project, you have those core assets imported into the spokes, and then the colored department ABC, that's actually where you're using features like extensions and refinements to modify code kind of at the edge, which then gets exposed to end users. So the first one to chat about here is extensions. This is a really useful feature which allows you to take some existing LookML object, essentially copy it and make modifications, and it will then do the kind of like do merge conflict, come away with like the final artifact. So in this sort of simple example, you might have a user's view that is sort of generally available to people, but then you might extend it and include a new dimension like age, as you can see, where the view then gets renamed user with age extension. This allows you to then add the user with age extensions onto other Explore assets. You might then extend the Explorer and actually use the age extension and have something like users with, demographics info. Might be like a separate Explorer you make for a specific use case. All that can be done with extends, and Looker handles the copying of the code and allows you to very easily build on what's been done before. There's a second feature called refinements, which is very similar to extends, but with some slight differences. It's kind of similar to like the remote and local nuances here. With refinements, it doesn't actually create a copy in a new LookML object, but instead kind of reads through the refinements that you've made, which are tweaks to the code, and executes them at runtime. And generally, with hub and spoke architecture, refinements for sure are the way to go. It's just a lot simpler. And a big sort of hats off to the Looker team for creating this. The screenshots here, this is actually a real project that I set up to help explain this concept. On the left-hand side, we have our hub project, and we have a bunch of Explorer files that are sort of what we call our core explorers for defining our key company concepts and join relationships. If you didn't know this, you can put explorers in their own files, and in doing so, it makes them a lot easier to extend and refine. So if you aren't doing this, I highly recommend it, especially if you get a model file that has 50 explorers in it. But what this allows us to do is to define our source of truth. And you can see there we have this particular join. I had to redact it for our security purposes, but I can kind of explain it at a high level. It's basically our applications and what kind of plans we've recommended to them. But here we have a base view, a couple joins, we've defined the relationships, we've defined what fields we want to help curate this for our end users. We use field sets, a lot of useful Looker features. And we also describe it as the source of truth for products we've submitted and what we've recommended. So that's all great. We're going to build our core metrics with that, maybe build core monitoring dashboards about our business performance. But then on the right-hand side, we have a spoke project, consumer solutions, as I mentioned. Maybe they've experimented with the new product recommendation algorithm. And what the hub and spoke architecture allows them to do is very simply on line 1, include that core explorer. from the hub, denoted by that double backslash. And you can see the imported projects on the left in the file directory. It's like we get access to that via the project import. We include it in our apps with new recommendations explorer, as you can see on the top of the name of the file. On line 4, we use the plus syntax to just denote that this is a refinement. And I just make some slight modifications. I overwrite the description by saying that this is a consumer solutions explorer. And if you want to report core metrics, do not use it, use the core one. And then I add in the consumer solutions specific join at the end. And that's my specific logic that I want to then expose to my business users. Maybe we're monitoring an experiment, this new recommendation algorithm, what have you. What's really great about hub and spoke architecture generally is that you get the balance between flexibility for your domains to move quickly. You launch a new feature, you immediately want to see what's going on, and the balance of governance where you're not polluting the core assets, just dumping in views, until you get like 150 joins, which is something I've actually seen here on a given explorer. So what this then does is kick off this cycle of virtuous development where ideally over time, your domains should actually bubble up what the most important views are for the business and actually integrate them into the hub as they become so important that everybody should be looking at them. So for example, let's say this product recommendation algorithm experiment actually turns out to be so great, it becomes mainlined and it's like the primary thing we use, recommend all our plans. Well, that to me, at that point, should probably be added into the hub. And it then becomes very easy for a domain to actually go in and make changes and have the data teams approve any modifications to the core assets. And that's where we can kind of meet in the middle with providing our developers the ability to move fast, but also to make sure that they're not going to break the core metrics or make the experience confusing and slow, for the 100 weekly active users that you have. So refinements, very, very key. And one last feature that I wanted to share with the group, it kind of builds on refinements, is access grants and filters. If you're going to be personalizing and modifying data for specific user groups or use cases, you'll definitely want to ensure that it's secure and authorized. So Dylan last month actually did a Spectacles webinar about access grants. If you wanted to learn more about those, definitely recommend that. But I actually have a real example on the right here of how we use those in practice here at Assurance with hub and spoke architecture on our external instance to securely provide data to external partners, the same internal metrics we look at to external partners. So we have our hub explorer, that's on our internal instance. It's non-restricted. It allows our sales operators, our analysts, data scientists, whomever, to access the data that they need. Then we remotely import the hub into the external instance. And then we include the explorer I care about into the model that provides access to the external partners in question here. Again, on line 15, you'll see that refinement syntax. It's a plus sign. So basically, the external partner is getting all of it that we get, but I add in this access filter that's been configured on the external instance so that when that partner looks at the data, we can be confident that they're only getting the records they're authorized to see. And it's also the exact same data that we're looking at internally. And I was able to do this without having to copy a single join or duplicate any logic. It's all just flows through because we're building on that modular LookML. And that will allow all of you faster and more confidently. Super nice feature there. So, simple in theory. We talked about some of the benefits, talked about some of those key features, but actually doing this in practice may be a little bit more challenging than you would hope, especially if your business has been using Looker for a while, or you have complexity, or you scaled up to even bigger than Assurance, maybe thousands of users and hundreds of developers. It can be pretty challenging. And I started doing it before Looker had that nice polished video. I made mistakes along the way, and I wanted to just sort of document these 3 high-level bullets and dig into them a little bit deeper before we conclude the webinar. But there's sort of 3 main things that came to mind from the field here. One is that this may require significant cultural change. The second is that you may want to consider a consistent coding framework to standardize your hub. You also may want to refactor the hub in place and then spin out your domains as opposed to trying to create something from scratch before rewrite. We're going to go into these in a little bit more detail each. So the first one, cultural considerations. First thing that I learned is that changing human behavior, it takes time, and it often takes far longer than we think. And, I think it's a bit dare I say, seductive to go off and do a bunch of research and see what others are doing, read, polished documentation and literature about how to do things, how to change technology. And it can be a bit misleading where, in your head, everything makes sense, but to people who are being introduced to those concepts for the first time, it will definitely be harder for them to understand what you mean, especially if you've gone deep down the rabbit hole of advanced looker features. So with that, I would be mindful, certainly, that one, it's going to take time to communicate your findings and learnings in a way that's simple enough for others to understand, but also you have to fit into their priorities. So you really need them to value it the way that you do. And in order to help with that, some tips from this great book, An Elegant Puzzle, that we're reading currently at Assurance, written by Will Larson, staff engineer at Stripe and Uber. Highly recommend this book. He talks about the importance of writing vision documents that you can circulate and get feedback on and refine. Simple one-pagers that explain what your team's purpose is, mandate, values it brings, so that you can then start small, build momentum, and communicate regular wins to the people whose behavior you're trying to change. As part of that, and this is recommended in the book on the right, simple self-serve documentation essential for communicating your ideas. And as part of that, as you circulate it around, what will likely happen is that a small group of people will kind of bubble up to the top, and really your ideas will really resonate with them. The idea of play and scale, and it's that group that you could potentially pilot any of your changes and scale out those ideas of at a high level, just like high quality data operations, flexibility, and governance. As part of this, one other sort of piece of literature I would definitely recommend is the data mesh. It got a lot of buzz in 2021 and 2022. Kind of like Hub and Spoke. It's very simple in theory, but much harder to do in practice, especially if a lot of legacy stuff working with. But at a high level, it basically means that you empower producers of data to own it fully, treat it like a product, and use a self-serve platform to provide it to end users securely. It's, like I said, kind of difficult to do that in practice, but I think the philosophy and the core concepts of data mesh are really essential in thinking about to incorporate into your Looker operations. So thinking about something like Hub and Spoke, where you have domains that own the data that is in there, I think is a great way to kind of integrate the concept of data mesh without deploying it fully and all of your technology being self-service architecture that automatically knows who's logged in and exactly what data they're allowed to access, which is technically pretty sophisticated. In order to implement those ideas, there are features out there that I would definitely consider, and Spectacles has mentioned these as well in some of their blog posts. CI/CD features like code owners in GitHub, you can actually carve up your core explorers, and assign ambassadors to them, and have them review the code on a regular basis within your data team to ensure that whatever standardized framework you're trying to deploy or whatever you're trying to do is actually being implemented correctly. And you really got to trust your end users and your developers for that. So on that note, one thing I think could really help before you try and go off and do any kind of Hub related things, a consistent coding framework in the Hub. I really believe that standardization can help drive adoption, because it will make it easier to use the modular LookML features. So if you have really nice, easy to use and understand self-serve documentation, and you piloted it with a few users, and you have a couple of use cases to refer to with your standardized consistent coding, that's going to drive more adoption and help make the cultural considerations a little bit easier. It also lays the foundation for automation of base LookML. And in doing our research, we came across a few methodologies. One I would definitely suggest is the base standard logical framework. That's actually a webinar that Spectacles team did back in November of 2022. I learned about it first from the article that they co-published by Kenny there, how to improve your LookML structure. Really great framework. If you're looking for one, I would definitely suggest it. But there are other ways to do this as well. There's some open source tools, open source linters like Look at Me Sideways or LAMS that has a linter style guide created by one of the early developers at Looker. It's a great tool. It can be a bit onerous and a bit restrictive, but like they say in their GitHub there, it can really help your project even without enforcement. It can get people thinking about consistency and standardization, and actually can clean up a little bit of your LookML, which can help drive adoption, as I mentioned. So one last note from the field here, that refactoring in place. It can be tempting to do a full rewrite from scratch. This was actually a mistake I made. I looked at the internal project and it was very daunting. I didn't want to try and untangle it and cause business disruption, especially during our critical seasonal periods where we make the majority of our revenues and profits. Definitely didn't want to pull the rug out there. So what I ended up doing was creating a side project and trying to build some of these better practices in there. We used that as the source of our truth for our hub, for our external site, and that worked pretty well. But it caused headaches later because we didn't go all in from the start. We didn't really know, should we move from the old project to the new one or what to do. So, unless you go all in, you're going to get headaches. You can get pushback. There's going to be friction. So in retrospect, I would say it's much better to use other tools that are out there to identify what explorers and like views and assets are being used the most, and then do your refactor campaigns in place, then spin out the domain so that they can inherit the standardized code framework and that they're all bought in already and ready to go. So there's a few open source, there's a few tools to help with this. One is the open source tool Henry, which is amazing, created by people at Looker. It allows you to put in your API creds and get you metadata about your explorers, your fields. Super helpful for a cleanup initiative and standardizing your code base. And then additionally, as you're doing refactors, definitely considering a CI/CD tool like Spectacles to help with this refactoring to ensure that it is non-disruptive. So that concludes my portion here, the Hub and Spoke architecture webinar. Going to hand it off to Dylan for the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mitch. I know everyone will find that super interesting. I certainly did. I'm going to pick out some of the questions from the Slack. If you have questions that you haven't yet asked, please head over to the Slack channel to do so. If you missed the messages, I'm just going to reshare them now. There's a link to sign up for it, and we're in the webinar Hub and Spoke channel. Perfect. So let me pull this up. So first one from Ben that says, we're planning on moving to Hub and Spoke models soon and rely on refinements for customization. Do you find there's any major roadblocks to only using refinements for customization? Do they have any limitations, or in general, can you pretty much do anything you'd be able to do if you're writing like a single view from scratch with refinements?
Yeah, one thing I would check out is sometimes the refinements can have sort of unintended effects where, at least this happened in my experience, where I would, especially if you're like kind of chaining multiple refinements one after another, where you think that you're going to be providing like a simple, customized end view for a user, but it actually ends up including like a lot of duplicated fields or what have you. Turns out, as I learned, that some of the refinements, their parameters or what you're changing in them is additive. So you might think that in your refinement, something's being overwritten, but in actuality, it's actually being added in. And this is written in some of the Looker documentation around extensions and refinements. So that's definitely something I would keep in mind. One thing that I also noted, especially if you're using Looker PDTs, is with extensions on PDTs, you can, and if you're including the same PDT into multiple models, the actual Looker in PDT creator can create multiple PDTs because it's viewing them all as distinct objects. And you can get wasted compute and just a slowdown of your system. So that's also something to keep in mind. But I would say generally, refinements have been working fairly well.
So, yeah, Ben, just to add to that, I think there's no technical limitations, like literally anything you could do by doing it like from scratch, you can do with a refinement. There's things with any added complexity, there's stuff you need to be wary of, but like technically speaking, there's no limitation there, at least as far as I'm aware of or I've seen in the past. Let's grab the next question from Tom, which is saying, so if you have a view like Office, but for labeling purposes, this can be used in different ways. So in some contexts, it's like the booking office. In some contexts, it's shipping office. Performing extensions of a view can be an effective way of managing the label while keeping like that view kind of singular, I guess, and drill sets, all of that defined once. Is that an approach that you've seen where you kind of got like a view that I guess gets joined multiple times or in different contexts gets used in different ways and use extensions and refinements for that purpose?
Yeah, I've definitely done that for labeling and also adding in sort of custom or defined fields, derived fields, as I like to call them. That's just like fields with case statements or whatever, dividing one field by another as well. I've definitely used that pattern before.
Nice. I can see a couple people are typing. Oh, here's another one. Do you see the ambassador as a central data team ambassador to Spokes? Sorry, I have asked that terribly. Do you see the ambassador for a Spoke as being like someone from the central data team, someone from the Spoke department, both? Kind of how do you think about ownership and championing what happens in Spokes and who's responsible around the organization?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the Looker video actually covers that a little bit, but I'll kind of augment it with my own sort of interpretation here. Is I would say generally to start, you're going to want data teams to be kind of owning the Spoke, especially as you scale out the system from the beginning. But I think long term, what's great about it is that it actually can encourage other folks in the business to ramp up their own technical skills and start contributing to Looker itself with the sort of guiding hand of the data team. So as you mentioned in your question, you kind of alluded to this, is like you might have one data representative and maybe sort of like an operations person or whomever to be like the other sort of business representative, and they co-own a particular Spoke or use case project. But what I really like to think about is how once people, like if you can make it as easy as possible, especially via your self-serve, simple to use documentation, to learn and understand a standardized system so that folks can get comfortable with making their own commits in Looker and actually running the data transform and serving process end to end, you can actually find latent developer capacity inside your organization and scale up your resources, which I think in today's environment is especially helpful if you're being constrained by headcount or just there's just way too much to do. Generally, it's like you can actually help train and develop others and help further their career and get more dev capacity in the process. It's like a careful sort of rollout plan, but I would say it's definitely possible. And I would be actively encouraging folks around the business to be doing the free LookML courses and trying to get involved to own their own data as per the data mesh principles.
I've got a second half to that one, which I think we'll also take as our last, which is, are there any caveats for external project imports in the hub and spoke model? Kind of any downsides you see to kind of those imports and how they might work?
Is that asking specifically about remote, like across instances, or just kind of generally project import?
I think, yeah, it just says external project import. So I think project import is probably generally remote or local.
Well, I've always found interesting is that if you go, so you have to enable it in I believe in the admin settings, and at the top it says this is a beta feature, which I find very surprising after like 3 years of using it. What it implies is that they may actually not release it like GA, and it could actually go away at some point in the future. I find that to be very, very unlikely, but it's always kind of been in the back of my mind. Is like, okay, if you fully commit to hub and spoke architecture and it relies on this feature that'll labeled as beta, it's, at the edge, kind of concerning. But given the fact that Looker has publicly stated that they use it, I would find it very hard to believe they would take it away. So that's one thing that definitely comes to mind. But in terms of, let's assume that's not going to happen. In terms of actually using it, I think it kind of comes back to the earlier question around like using extensions and refinements. Is like sometimes when people are extending and refining things, it doesn't actually work the way that you want. So you might actually need a little bit more oversight and governance for folks who aren't as familiar with extension and refinements features and haven't made enough mistakes to like learn what the gotchas are. So I would say like the caveat there, something to be aware of, is like you're opening the door to allowing people to extend and refine and sort of modify their assets. And as you get further and further away from the data teams, it may not work the way that you want. And there could be some risk there. So that's something to be aware of.
I have one thing here, which is, if you're using this, doesn't apply to remote project imports. So remote project imports, you kind of like pin a Git repo and you pick the commit, and all of that's kind of very well structured. If you're using local project imports and you're developing, so I'm developing in project A, which imports project B. As I'm in developer mode in Looker, my like development experience and the Explorer experience is going to use the current branch that I'm on in Project B, but also the current branch that I'm on in the upstream project. There's kind of, I think, the native your like default assumption is like, hey, I'm changing the downstream and I'm using upstream as of like production or something like that. And in reality, you're as of the last branch that you were on the last upstream project. And so that's like, it's not a massive problem, but it's something you need to be aware of. And so, for example, in Spectacles, this is as much as I'll plug us during this webinar. When you're testing the downstream, we make sure that we pin the upstream to prod. So when you're making a change to the downstream project, we say, okay, isolate the change to just this, make sure that that user state when we're running the tests is production on the upstream. And so we can kind of make sure that we're highlighting like issues with that specific change. The second part of this is that it's, I think, a little hard sometimes, and again, it's all manageable, to know if you're changing the upstream project, what are the impacts that I'm going to have on the downstream. So if I like remove this dimension in the upstream project, is that going to break content? Is that going to, are people using that? What's going to happen? And so the second bit of my plug is Spectacles is going to have a lot of functionality coming out probably in Q3 this year around that. We're saying, hey, I'm changing a project that is actually imported in 12 different places. I want to go, when I make a change to the upstream project, go and make sure that those 12 places are still fine and that I'm not breaking stuff. And I think that has been, I think like the lack of that testing being native in Looker is some of the, has been like one of the areas where people have had reluctance to adopt this like added complexity. But I think with better automated testing, actually you can de-risk these types of projects in a major way. Mitch, I've got one final one for you, which is in your hub project, do you have one model, multiple models? How do you kind of think about structuring
that? Great. Okay. I was wondering if somebody would kind of catch on. So if you recall from the Looker screen, from the video, the screenshot, what they were saying is like you have a hub project and official spoke. There's no models in the hub project, but there are in the official spoke, and that's what sort of provisions access and all the metrics that power your core dashboards, what have you. When we looked at that design, we actually chatted internally and we decided to actually drop the idea of the official spoke, but instead just have the hub and have the model in there, the core models in there as well. And all the data team members would be operating in the hub because collectively the data team owns the hub. The reason we did that is because when we thought about changing the cultural considerations and actually like deploying these changes and getting people adopted and understanding how it works, this added friction of like having an additional project where it's like you have a hub, but you also have an official spoke, and like you got to make changes in there and there. It just seemed like it was additional, like unnecessary overhead. And for us, it felt simpler to explain, to be like, hey, that crazy massive project that we all don't really like love operating in, that's going to be our hub. And that model that's been in there, that's been provisioning access for ages, we're just going to keep that the same way it is. That's going to be our core model. And we just personally felt like that was way simpler to explain and get over the hurdle and get people on board to do. But it is really up to you how you want to do it. That's how Looker/Google does it. But yeah, it's up to you to experiment, see what works.
Awesome. I think we're going to call it there. Mitch, thank you very much for this. It's been super interesting. Really cool to see how you guys have been tackling this at Assurance, and I'm sure we'll get you back on at some point in the future. To all of the attendees, thank you very much. As ever, we kind of do this for all of you. The kind of active questions in the Slack, the engagement for everyone really makes this worthwhile. So we really appreciate it. 2 webinars coming up, already announced, 1 in 2 weeks on connected sheets, so Looker and Google Sheets together, and then 1 in 4 weeks on system activity explorers. And so you can head to spectacles.dev/webinars to sign up for any of those. And we will hopefully see you all in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much and have a great day. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.